The chipped ceramic mug felt impossibly light in my hands, a stark contrast to the weight pressing down on my chest. 20 years. 20 years since the comfortable silence of our family dinners, a silence punctuated by the clinking of cutlery and the murmur of contented presence, had been shattered. Shattered, not with a bang, but with the insistent, joyful cries of a new life, a life that, in their eyes, instantly rendered mine obsolete. I remember that day so vividly, etched into my memory like a scar. The hushed excitement in the hallway, a palpable buzz that vibrated through the floorboards. The gifts piled high, a towering testament to the anticipated arrival, each ribbon a bright, mocking stripe against the backdrop of my diminishing importance. And me, the 17-year-old daughter, suddenly rendered invisible, my carefully cultivated achievements and my very presence an inconvenient afterthought. They'd smoothed my hair, a perfunctory gesture that felt alien even then, patted my hand with fingers that seemed to rush their touch, and told me, in voices laced with a forced cheerfulness, that I was a big girl now, that I'd understand. Oh, I understood perfectly. I was no longer the center of their universe, and in their newly contracted world, that meant I was no longer in their universe at all. They re-emerged, from whatever shadow they had occupied, 6 months ago. Not with apologies, not with even a flicker of recognition for the deep, yawning chasm they'd carved into my life, but with a casualness that was almost artful in its cruelty. A perfectly worded email, a sterile, impersonal missive forwarded through a distant relative, announcing their son's engagement. They were coming to town. They wanted to see me. My heart, I swear, stuttered for a solid minute, a discordant rhythm against the steady beat of my carefully constructed independence. 20 years. 20 years of careful, quiet living, of building a life brick by deliberate brick, a life that had absolutely no room for them, and now this. A wedding. A chance to slot me back into their narrative, perhaps as a prop for their son's perfect, glittering life, or worse, as a stark, unwelcome reminder of the daughter they'd managed to sideline so efficiently, so thoroughly. I'd always been the quiet one, the bookish one. While my younger brother, the celebrated arrival, the one who had so effortlessly eclipsed me, was boisterous and demanding, a force of nature that demanded and received attention, I was content with my corner. Happy to observe, to absorb, to be a silent witness. My parents, it turned out, had a distinct preference for the spotlight, a thirst for the adulation that came with being the custodians of a star. They'd poured all their energy, their hopes, their undivided attention into him, the golden child, the heir apparent to their imagined dynasty. My report cards, the meticulously crafted essays I'd poured my heart into, my small, hard-won victories, my very existence were met with polite nods, a distracted smile that didn't quite reach their eyes, then a swift, almost imperceptible pivot back to whatever new milestone he'd reached, whatever dazzling new feat he'd accomplished. I learned to be self-sufficient early, a survival instinct kicking in before I even fully understood the implications. I learned to not need their validation, their praise, their attention. It was a painful, lonely lesson, but it forged a resilience they never anticipated, a quiet strength that grew in the fertile ground of their neglect. The years that followed were a study in strategic detachment. I moved cities for university, seeking not just an education, but an escape. I chose a career that, by sheer geographical fortune, took me far from their orbit, a deliberate step away from the gravitational pull that had once defined my existence. I didn't cut them off. That would have been too dramatic, too confrontational, too much like the kind of theatrical outburst they might have acknowledged. Instead, I simply faded. Birthdays became cards sent by mail, the handwritten messages brief and impersonal, holidays were polite, brief phone calls filled with carefully curated updates about my life that never encroached on their own, never offered any real insight, any genuine vulnerability. I became a ghost in their familial landscape, present only in the abstract, a name they could mention without consequence, a footnote in the grand narrative of their son's ascent. Their son, Mark, was everything I wasn't. Charismatic, popular, effortlessly charming, a natural performer who seemed to inhabit the world with a vibrant ease. He thrived on the attention, soaking it up like a thirsty sponge, his every utterance met with enthusiastic encouragement. I watched from a distance, through the occasional family photo shared by extended relatives on social media, as he grew into the perfect replica of what they'd always wanted, the idealized son they had envious. Ionied from the moment he entered the world. He was a success in their eyes, lauded for achievements that, in my own quiet, understated way, I'd matched or even surpassed, but mine were never deemed worthy of fanfare, never celebrated with the same effusive praise. It was the quiet, persistent sting of being the background music to someone else's dazzling symphony, the muted hum that underscored their vibrant melody. When their email arrived, a knot of something cold and unpleasant tightened in my stomach. The engagement. The desire to reconnect. I reread the words, scanning them again and again, searching for a hint of remorse, a shred of acknowledgement of the decades of silence, of my quiet, insidious abandonment. There was none. It was purely transactional, a pragmatic consideration for their wedding guest list that needed filling, a daughter who might serve some ancillary purpose in their carefully orchestrated event. A placeholder, perhaps, or a convenient plus one. My first instinct, a familiar echo of past hurts, was to ignore it. To delete the email, to banish it to the digital ether and pretend it never arrived. But then, a different feeling began to surface, a slow, steady wave rising against the tide of my ingrained reaction. Not anger, not sadness, not even a flicker of resentment. Instead, a profound sense of stillness. The kind of stillness that settles after a long, arduous journey, when you finally reach a place of profound clarity, a quiet understanding that transcends emotional turbulence. 20 years I had lived in their shadow, or rather, in the vast, echoing void they had left behind. I had done the work. I had painstakingly rebuilt myself. I had healed, in my own quiet, deliberate way. And now, they wanted to re-enter my life on their terms, as if the intervening 2 decades had been nothing more than a brief interlude. I didn't reply to the email immediately. I allowed the silence to stretch, to breathe, to become a statement in itself. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years, something that felt both profoundly nostalgic and unexpectedly powerful. I sat down and wrote a letter. Not an email, with its fleeting immediacy and impersonal nature, but a physical letter, with a pen and paper, the kind that requires deliberate thought, a tangible imprint of one's words. I wrote about my life, not with the guardedness I usually employed, the carefully constructed walls I'd built around my inner world, but with a quiet, unadorned candor. I wrote about my work, the deep satisfaction I found in it, the tangible impact I made, the kind, intelligent people I'd met, the small, meaningful joys I'd cultivated over the years. I wrote about my friendships, the deep, genuine connections I'd fostered, the unwavering support systems I'd created, the shared laughter and quiet understanding that formed the bedrock of my social life. I didn't boast, I didn't compare, I simply stated facts about my existence, a life lived fully, independently, and with a quiet grace. I mentioned, almost as an aside, as a casual detail, that I had plans for the wedding weekend, a long-standing commitment I couldn't possibly reschedule. A conference, perhaps, or a cherished friend's milestone celebration. Something vague enough to be unassailable, yet specific enough to signify a prior, non-negotiable engagement, a testament to the life I'd built that existed entirely independent of their schedule. Then, I addressed the core of it, the unspoken elephant in the room. Not accusatorially, not with any hint of blame, but as an observation, a gentle statement of fact. I wrote about how I understood that life takes different paths, how children grow and find their own ways, their own destinies. I wrote that I had always respected their focus on Mark, their unwavering dedication to his upbringing, and that in that space, I had found my own path, one that had brought me peace and profound fulfillment. I wished them well, sincerely, for their son's upcoming marriage, a genuine desire for their happiness in this new chapter. I signed off with my name. No endearments, no familial titles, no love, or with all my heart. Just my name, a simple, factual identifier, a woman who had forged her own identity. I mailed the letter. The weight of it, the physical act of sending it, felt like a finality, a release. And then, I waited. The silence that followed was the most potent response I could have imagined, a deafening quiet that spoke volumes. No frantic calls, no follow-up emails demanding an explanation for my supposed absence, my deliberate choice. The absence itself was my statement, a silent declaration of independence. The wedding came and went. I saw photos online, a distant cousin's fleeting Instagram stories, a blurry snapshot of a reception hall. My parents looked happy, proud, beaming at their son, their perfect, golden child. I was not in any of the pictures. My absence, I later learned through the grapevine, the intricate network of familial gossip, had caused a minor ripple. Whispers, hushed questions directed at my parents. "Where's your daughter?" And I was told, the explanation was a dismissive, almost nonchalant, "Oh, she has such a busy life, you know. Always traveling for work." A convenient, almost enviable excuse for their absent child, a testament to the independent spirit they had unintentionally cultivated. But the true consequence, the one that resonated long after the wedding photos faded from my digital feeds, came a few weeks later. My mother called. It was the first time she'd initiated contact in over a year, a call that felt like an anomaly in the carefully constructed silence. Her voice was tight, strained, a brittle quality that betrayed an underlying agitation. She didn't ask about my conference or my travels. She asked, almost demanding, why I hadn't been there. She spoke of family unity, of obligation, of how Mark had asked about me, a manipulative tactic designed to evoke guilt. It was a performance of hurt, of disappointment, a familiar script designed to elicit a desired emotional response, a performance I had witnessed countless times before. I listened, my own voice calm and steady, a deliberate contrast to her emotional crescendo. I didn't apologize. I simply reiterated, gently, that I had prior commitments, and that I had sent my well wishes. I spoke about the life I had built, the one that didn't revolve around their expectations, the one that was entirely my own. I mentioned, just once, the quietness of those 20 years, the long stretches of solitude, and how I had learned to fill that space with my own peace, my own contentment. There was a long pause on her end, a silence that felt different from the previous ones. It wasn't empty, it was filled with a dawning, uncomfortable realization, the slow, dawning understanding of a truth she had long avoided. She stammered a few more words, a plea that sounded more like an accusation, a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative, before the call ended abruptly. I haven't heard from them since. And I don't expect to. The bridge is burned, not with the destructive fire of outright conflict, but with the quiet, unwavering certainty of self-possession. They discarded me once, assuming my pieces were too broken, too insignificant, to ever be reassembled. They were wrong. They re-emerged seeking a familiar comfort, a familiar dependence, a daughter who would unquestioningly slot back into her designated place. Instead, they found a stranger, a woman who had learned to thrive in the landscape they had abandoned her in, a woman who had found her own son and grown towards it. The justice wasn't in their suffering, not in any desire for them to experience pain, but in their reluctant realization that the daughter they deemed irrelevant had simply outgrown their need for her, and in doing so, had reclaimed herself, her life, and her own narrative.